trust fund got passed, and just as it was sort of, we were all celebrating that victory, the money that was supposed to go into the trust fund, which was from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, got stolen away because as those institutions went into receivership. So I think there are two different things here. One is, in the short term, having money go into the trust fund is important. There's $1 billion that the president's put in his budget for the trust fund. The tricky thing about that is the money is mandatory funding. I'm going to start speaking Greek here if I'm not careful, because we get into Washington budget talk. But the bottom line is, what we essentially need is, any time a tax bill is going to pass, if there's any kind of tax bill, we need to find a way to use tax offsets, any savings from taxes, any offsets on the mandatory side for funding this trust fund. And so that's something we need to keep fighting for in the short run. In the long run, we need to set up a permanent source of funding for the trust fund. And so we put out last year, the administration did, the Obama administration, a white paper on housing finance reform. And one of the things, among the many things that we said about how to fix the system, we said there needs to be a dedicated off-budget source of funding, dependable source of funding for affordable housing. And that is the big opportunity that we have. As we think about, and as we pass legislation on what to do with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, what the housing finance system of the future should look like, not something you all might typically be engaged in. Sort of, well, that, wonky stuff on, mortgages for people that aren't necessarily living in our neighborhoods. This is really important, because the numbers are so big that we could generate, $3, $5, $10 billion a year with a relatively small share of the costs in that system. And so this is, as I see it, in a second Obama term, the big opportunity. The big opportunity for a new source of funding for the trust fund. And the reason I say in a second term, we're not going to get this year, a legislative package through Congress on housing finance reform. It's just not going to happen. So this is something that we're all going to have to stay on. And again, that's why I say short term, let's get some money into the trust fund. We have regulations that we put out that would require the money to go to the very lowest income to extremely low income, distribute it through the states, so the state housing finance agencies, NJ will be happy. That all we need to do. But we also, in the long run, have to get this money as a dedicated source, permanent dedicated source.
Okay, thanks. So here's a question in honor of our municipal officials that are with us today. What would you recommend to local municipalities that are cash-strapped in order to sustain their development activities?
Other than prayer. No. Look, this is one of the things I loved about the work I did in New York City was figuring out ways to make creative uses and creative sources for doing affordable housing development. I am a big fan of inclusionary zoning and thinking about ways to use the zoning code to be able to get not just housing but other public benefits. And I think that takes two things. One is, let's be clear, if there's no market for development, those programs aren't. That's not a successful route. But I think particularly given some of the development, places like Ray and I were talking in Newark, in a set of places where you are seeing development happening, where there is a market developing, thinking about how to construct a zoning code that takes advantage of that, I think second thing I would say about it is, too often, in my experience, this becomes, and you've obviously had that in the fight about COA and the Laurel stuff here. It's obviously very recent developments on that front. But too often, what you find is affordable housing advocates and private development community at odds about this. And what I found in New York is you can actually reverse that and get alignment with developers and advocates if you construct these in the right way. And the reason I say that is if this is about getting more density, right? Not just, well, you're allowed to do 3 houses or 3 stories or whatever it is, and within that, it's a sort of zero-sum game. You're now going to have to produce. You end up in a different place. What we were willing to do in New York was to say, look, okay, we're going to do some upzoning here. We'll go to, depending on the neighborhood, it's 5 stories, 10 stories. In some cases, it was 30 stories if you're going to do market rate development. But if we're going to do a bonus of 25% or a third in density, if you're willing to do the affordable housing. And guess what? Every developer that's developing under those is taking the bonus because the economics are so much better. So a lot of this is about getting the economics right so that you can align the development community and advocates in a way that's a pretty powerful force. And when I started the Bloomberg administration with a big fight with the neighborhoods about this, we ended up ultimately having the development community and advocates cheering on and pushing these zones. There were clearly some folks still, we don't want any more density. That, I'm not saying this was easy. I did have to get protected by police in a couple of these community board meetings, but you really can start to change the dynamic where you have the power of that. The other thing I would say, and this is really on the side of where you have neighborhoods where there isn't as much sort of market potential. I think there are real NSP and some of these other efforts are obviously very important. But I think there's the opportunity to think about how to tap into other types of funds that you wouldn't traditionally think about. We created an acquisition fund in New York. We took $8 million of city money, and ultimately we were able to raise about $200 million. Diane talked about the land banking law that's moving forward. We put together this acquisition fund, about $200 million. We actually won an Innovation in Government Award from the Kennedy School of Government for it, because we were able to raise all of this money to allow nonprofits to be able to get control of sites quickly. And it was a very small city investment that was leveraged by other forms of investment. The basic idea was you're not going to come in and apply for tax credits and get that award quickly enough when a site is selling in your neighborhood or when it's available. You got to be able to be much more nimble. And so come into this acquisition fund, which is outside of government, get your money very quickly, and then come back to us and finance out that acquisition loan and be able to get the land that then you can enter in the project, or hold it for a while if it's a land banking strategy. So that's an example of something that can clearly be done to help. The other is to really focus on preservation as well, and to make sure that, well, at a time when a market is struggling, is there a market opportunity to acquire things to be able to control properties because the prices are in a place where they're not where they otherwise might have been, and preserving that housing and shifting your strategies from maybe less new construction to preservation makes some sense. So those are a couple ideas I would